Welcome everyone! You're stepping into the Twilight Zone. This is going to be season 4, episode 15. It is called The Incredible World of Horace Ford. So spoilers for the episode as always. This one definitely retreads familiar ground. If you go all the way back to like season 1's, I think it was called Walking Distance. Very similar ideas. It's about a man who's middle-aged, thinking once again about his childhood. But this also reminded me a little bit of the episode earlier this season with Robert Duvall, the one where he becomes obsessed with the miniatures in the museum. And a lot of that episode, I remember talking about how it was, in large part what was so impressive about it was the other characters around him talking about how to treat him and his perceived medical condition. I felt a lot of reminiscence to that one as well in this. Although I do think that one was superior, I think everything I was comparing to in this one wasn't quite as good. And the same goes for the other elements as well, to be honest. It's kind of a... I don't want to call it a bad episode, but it's definitely a mediocre one. I think partly because it does retread a lot of familiar ground, partly because it's less defined. It's almost like in its ways to feel different from the previous similar stories on Twilight Zone. It kind of... just, there was elements where I was sort of left thinking and trying to analyze, okay, what does this particularly mean? And maybe there is a meaning behind it, but it definitely wasn't coming to me naturally, and it definitely wasn't speaking to me throughout the screen. But the main gist of this is that Horace Ford is this man who's about to turn 38, and he works for a toy manufacturer. He designs the toys, he draws up the schematics, and the episode's really about him starting to obsess over his childhood. He starts to tell stories about his childhood. He starts talking kind of like a child at times, with the way he's enthusiastic about reliving these memories of the street that he grew up on. And he talks about the games they used to play. He talks about that one time so-and-so got his arm caught in the fire hydrant, this one time that so-and-so tripped over this thing, this one time so-and-so did this. He's constantly bringing up all these stories, to the point where it's starting to worry people around him. His wife, his boss, his co-worker, his mother, they're all starting to become concerned that he's just ignoring what he's supposed to be talking about and pivoting and obsessing is the word into this. And then there's the actual real science fiction element where he visits this street again from his childhood, but it's actually like it's the time period that he grew up in, and he even sees his friends of that time period as kids. So it's like he's walking into a memory, which is very Walking Distance. So that's the basic kind of setup of it. And the main character is played by Pat Hingle, which I probably wouldn't have mentioned except for the fact that I recognize that name because that is Commissioner Gordon from the first 4 Batman movies. I'm not very fond of those movies, and I'm not very fond of that version of Commissioner Gordon, but I did recognize the name. So he's here. He lives with his wife and his mother, or maybe I should say his mother lives with them. That's fine, whatever, that's not that weird. But I think what sticks out to me here is that this character is so quirky, and and I guess we assume that he's gotten worse. I think we have to assume that this condition is something that's coming up because he is turning 38, because it's been X number of years and it's kind of a midlife crisis effectively. But, he has a very attractive wife who is a housewife who cares for him deeply, and it kind of sticks out as you're watching this episode. I'm almost curious how this guy ended up with her, because she seems a little bit out of his league. And he must have been more professional and adult, because the way he acts around his boss in this episode is super unprofessional. He raises his voice, he gets mad when he's told to redesign a toy. Basically the robot that he designs is too complicated, there's too many parts, it's going to cost a fortune to manufacture, and he's told to just simplify it. And he basically throws a temper tantrum and talks about how the flashing eyes are integral to what the toy is. You can't do this is my design, kind of thing. He reacts and overreacts, and his boss is actually very kind of understanding. His boss, later in the episode, the boss comes to see him, and he's not done the work he's supposed to because he's obsessing over these memories of his childhood. And the boss, instead of outright just firing him on the spot, which he he's been spoken back to very inappropriately multiple times by this part of the story. He instead says you should probably go on leave and maybe see a therapist. He's actually a very kind and understanding boss. He's given him he's like, I think you might be unwell, and I'm going to give you a chance to go and deal with that. I'm not going to just take your job away. But then Horace says, oh, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm not doing this. And he ends up getting himself fired by talking back. But he kind of puts his boss in this place. And maybe it works for the episode that his boss isn't some dickhead, that he actually is an understanding person, because it just kind of further exemplifies the fact that the main character is the one who's acting irrationally. You don't want the audience to be kind of siding with him when it comes to the boss. I don't think there's any point in this episode where you really side with him. You're always on the side of the people around him, watching him deteriorate, even though we see him witness some things that would make him probably have a bit of a breakdown. Where it gets murky, where it gets really murky though, because everything I've said so far has been mostly fine. This definitely feels like one that didn't need to be an hour-long episode, though. Like, I absolutely think this could have had all the beats that it needed and be done in the 25-minute episode. It feels very padded to me. I know you have rule of threes, but he goes to the street in the past 3 times, and I think you really could have done without the middle one. The middle one didn't really add a whole lot, I don't think, other than just establishing that it's still happening. It's the same night again, because when he goes back, when he goes to the street the first time, you get all these little things that happen. He runs into the guy selling hot dogs out of a stand. He bumps into a couple. This woman yells out the window. And when he goes back the second time, all these things happen again. So rule of threes, the second time reveals that it's the same night repeating. It's not like he's going back and living another night from his childhood. But I do think that it does kind of bog the episode down, and there's a lot of repeated scenes of his wife becoming concerned, or his mother becoming concerned. And I was wondering if it was, I can't remember the title of the episode, but there was that episode, I think last season, where it was the new couple, and it was all about the husband, the new husband going around the house, and he's basically just remembering all of his memories with his mother. And it was kind of this metaphor for this guy who, the new wife was competing with his dead mother for affection, kind of thing. And I was almost wondering if it was doing something kind of similar here, where he's kept the mother around, and it's almost like having her around is making him sort of revert to childhood a bit more. I don't think it actually was going for that necessarily. Maybe not, at least not by much. There's definitely one part later in the episode when he starts, that's after he's been fired, when the mother kind of starts to get upset and yell at him and stuff. And it does kind of feel like he's talking back to her the same way that he would talk back to her when he was a kid. So that's what was making me think that. But I don't think it was going down that path. And I think what's weird about it is that when it ultimately makes its point, which is the third time he goes to the street, and he actually turns into a kid version of himself. And it turns out this entire scene was built, it's basically a repressed memory. He got beat up by all the kids that were supposed to be his friends because he maybe didn't invite them to his birthday party, but that's only according to them. We don't really get the real backstory as to what built up to this. When the wife gets concerned, when he's supposed to be at his surprise birthday party, she goes to the street herself and she finds him. When he gets up, he's talking a bit more adult again, and the point effectively, and they kind of spell this out to the audience, is that he's been remembering all these happy things from his childhood. He's been reminiscing and feeling nostalgic for the past, but he kind of conveniently forgot that some of it was really bad, that some of it was actually really shit. And this repressed memory was actually a really bad thing that happened to him that he'd kind of forgotten about. And all these nights, these memories were building up to this. Now, that's a fine point, the dangers of nostalgia. The wife literally says the line, we remember the good things and we, forget the bad things so that we can cope, so that we don't need to be burdened with them our entire lives. And it's, a little bit of the danger and nostalgia in a way. What doesn't work about that for me is, one, that it feels like it really does just kind of play its cards close to its chest right until that very last 5 minutes, where it kind of then tries to make that point when it turns out this is this kind of like unpleasant memory. But also the fact that I don't really think the rest of the episode thematically completely lines up with that. Like the way he becomes obsessed with the past. Like, okay, he's turning 38, he's getting older, he's deep in, he's, well, not deep into middle age, I'm not that much younger than him, I don't want to say that, but he's getting into like official proper middle age, right? He's approaching 40, 38 specifically in this case, and he is feeling the pressure of supporting himself, his wife, and his mother. He's feeling the pressure of like his responsibilities at work, and he's longing for a simpler time. Like I can understand all those things, but none of this necessarily really explains why he becomes obsessed the way he quite does, and the way he sort of just is disconnected from everyone around him. That really does paint it as more of like a really serious thing. And I guess he is kind of like fixed at the end of the episode, but it feels a little bit. It doesn't really feel like all the dots connect to me when I was watching it. I wasn't sure what to expect from the ending, and I think the ending is one of the better parts of the episode because it feels like it's making a clear point. But I don't necessarily think that his behavior throughout the whole episode really adds up, and part of that might be that they had to fill a whole hour of him. So instead of him having a couple of scenes after he effectively time traveled and being obsessed with the fact that he time traveled, and people thinking, oh, he's starting to sound crazy because he's saying that he saw these people as kids when they're the same age as him. Instead, it feels like it goes in circles for a while, where he keeps ignoring people around him, and he starts doing this before he even goes to the street. It just gets worse after he goes to the street. And even after he goes to the street, he's not just talking about the fact that he went to the street and saw these things. He starts just picking out all these old memories to talk about as well. But the big thing that I've not mentioned yet, which also makes this incredibly murky, is that there's this running thing that every time he goes to the street, he drops his watch, right? And obviously symbolizes time turning back, a watch. They mentioned that he used to have a Mickey Mouse watch at one point, and eventually it turns into that. But after each time, one of his old friends, one of the kids from this time traveling street, effectively, like they show up at the front door of the apartment, and the wife sees this kid, and the kid says he dropped this and hands her the watch. And this happens after the first time, and she sees him. It happens after the second time, and she sees him. And then the third time it happens is during the birthday party. This time the watch is changed to the Mickey Mouse one, and she decides to go to the street herself, right? So none of this, the entire episode when these scenes were hitting, I was sort of racking my brain thinking, okay, what does it mean that she's also seeing one of these kids? And indeed, when she goes and sees her husband in the modern version of the street, which is a bit more run down, it's very Back to the Future, when you see it like perfect in the 50s, and then you see it all sort of run down in the 80s. The modern one for the time period looks a lot less sort of alive, shall we say. The old version's like bustling with all these like fruit stands and all sorts of things. But when she finds him, she actually sees him as a little boy first. She sees her husband, like the 10-year-old version, and then she looks away and he turns back into the adult version. I've racked my brain, and I honestly can't think of a good reason for this. Certainly not in a concrete in-universe way. Thematically, I could sit here and try and think of something like that in some level, because it is her husband. She's recognizing like what he's feeling. The idea that she's like getting the message that there's something traumatic in his past that's bothering him. But it's not just her though. Like the third time she sees this kid, everyone, like it's at this surprise party for him, sees the kid. So I really just never felt like I got a good concrete reason in my head to justify this, other than just it's weird and it feels weird and it's adding to the Twilight Zone-esque mystery. Some of the elements of this episode kind of feel like we're trying to Twilight Zone it up a little bit by giving these extra weird moments. And I do wonder if you cut out all these moments with this kid coming to the door, again, that helps you get it down to the half-hour version of the episode. And I don't know I don't know if it would really take anything away other than make it less confusing to me. I really don't have a good answer. If people have a good sort of theory or analysis for what her seeing this kid and what the others seeing this kid the last time he comes to the door represents, because if it was just Horace, right, who's seeing stuff, like it's all in his head basically, right? That's how you read it. In fact, even her seeing him as a little boy, when he's lying in the alleyway after he's been beat up, right, at the end, he's been beat up in this flashback as a little kid, and when he wakes up as an adult, he's got the cut and the bruise on his face. So there's some sort of weird timey-wimey things happen. But at least, I think even her seeing him as a little boy, you can just read that as her seeing him as a little boy in her head, right? The idea that he looks vulnerable, that he looks like he's in need, that she needs to be there to protect him, that she feels the need to protect him, right? You can explain that one away as kind of in her head, and it kind of connects to her husband. But this kid showing up at the door with the watch multiple times, almost like his mind, like if his mind is manifesting this stuff, it's almost like this is him reaching out as a cry for help to his wife. But I'm not necessarily saying that his mind is manifesting all this. Well, it kind of is. If it's all internal, it is, but that doesn't explain how anyone else is seeing any of these kids. Actually, which leads me to, this is like just a silly complaint. This is not like an important thing, but it was bugging me throughout the episode. So there's like multiple scenes of this episode where he comes home from work or he comes home from visiting the street. So you probably see Horace come home like 6 times, maybe more, over the course of this episode. And every time he's greeted by his wife or he's greeted by his mother or both. Despite this, right? Despite the fact that 6 times, 7 times, however many it is that he comes home, and every single time he just walks through the front door, which is not weird, as he should. It's his apartment. Makes sense. However, there's a time early on in the episode, in the middle somewhere, where the doorbell goes and the wife thinks it must be him. And it turns out to be the kid, I think. And I was like, why would he be ringing the doorbell? Okay, whatever. Not a big deal. I'll move on. But it does it again. When the surprise party's happening, right, and the friend from work's there with his wife and a couple other people are in the apartment, right, they hear the doorbell and the wife's like, shh, that's him. And she turns off the lights so they can all yell surprise when they open the door. And all I could think was, but why would he be ringing the doorbell? It's his house. It doesn't make any sense. And even on its own, it wouldn't make sense. But the fact is we've seen him come home, like I say, at least half a dozen times throughout the course of this episode, and not one time did he ever ring the doorbell. So even just in the episode's own internal logic, it's shown us repeatedly that he never does this. It's such a small, stupid thing, and obviously it's because they want that moment where they're going to yell surprise, and it's the kid with the watch instead. The kid from the 40s or 30s or whatever year it's supposed to be. I get it, but it feels like a shortcut for that moment as opposed to having a good reason. Like maybe you just hear a noise outside the door, and because she's worried about him, and she is very worried about him at this point, and she's repeatedly said maybe he needs to see the doctor, she pulls out the phone book and she's looking for people to help him. One of the more interesting scenes of the episode, as little as this may seem, because, much like that Robert Duvall episode, one of the things that I was latching onto maybe a little bit more is how the characters around him maybe treat him and sort of recognize that he needs help. And I think that the boss is a good example of that. But his co-worker, who's also an old friend, we see him interact with him a few times, and halfway or so through the episode, the wife comes to his work, but not to see Horace, to see Horace's workplace friend. And she goes to him and basically says what all her concerns are, that he's getting lost in his mind, he's talking about his childhood and all that. And the friend says that, I mean, he says that that's nothing super new, but like he is always able to just quickly to get him to snap out of it, which makes it sound like on some level this has always been a part of his character. But this is obviously getting worse because he's not snapping out of it, he's becoming obsessed. And again, the only thing I can think of is that it is kind of a midlife crisis thing, because he's hitting his late 30s, he's feeling this pressure, and I enjoyed this little thread of the friend kind of recognizing that, going in to talk to him and trying to sort of like get him to open up about the story. But at this point, Horace shuts off and says, "No, I'm not going to tell you because you're just going to look at me with a blank face, like my wife did." And then he refuses to talk to him. And then the boss comes in and they have that scene, and that's why it doesn't go anywhere. But that's building, like, it was almost like the building of the real character in these scenes where the friend's talking to the wife or talking to Horace directly, the boss is talking to Horace. And then likewise, after he gets fired and he goes home and he has the scene where he's talking to his wife and the mother, he eventually starts, like, they keep saying, oh, like, the mother gets really scared at first. It's like, well, what are we going to do? That's a weekly paycheck. How are we going to support ourselves? Like, this is a big deal. You've worked there for 15 years. Whereas the wife's more understanding. The wife sort of says, oh, it's okay. You're going through some stuff. Let's take the weekend and sort of, like, give you some time to relax and sort of, find your footing, and we'll start looking for a new job for you on Monday. She's very kind of like gentle and proactive about it. It's very much a contrast to the mother, which is why I was thinking the episode might be getting to, like, how they treat him differently, and that may be something that it's really going into. But in hindsight, the thing that stuck out to me the most about this scene was actually, eventually in the sequence, he does actually start to kind of like show some of the concerns the mother has, where he's like, yeah, wait a minute, like, I'm supposed to support my mother and also you and me. That's 3 people. What am I going to do? And that was a scene more than anything that kind of told me that part of this is being caused with this like constant like life pressure of having to, just have responsibilities more than anything else. But specifically in his case, having to support 3 people with his job, and the pressure of that maybe is part of what's getting to him. He's longing for a time where he didn't have responsibilities. He's longing for a time when he didn't have to be somewhere, or for people to rely on him, all these things. So that part makes sense. Like, I get like the broad strokes of what it's doing, but a lot of it just doesn't quite connect in a way that I think a lot of good Twilight Zone episodes do, even ones that are more suggestive. And this one is definitely a suggestive episode that never gives you like an actual reason why anything's happening, in terms of like the time travel part, which is why I was mostly thinking of it as being in his head. But the kid appearing to the wife as well kind of throws a wrench in that, and which is why I was kind of really trying to wrap my head around what that represented, that she was also seeing one of these kids. But I don't really have a good answer. I tried to come up with one a little bit ago in the review. I guess that was okay, but I don't really feel that good about it. And I think the fact that I can't land on something that I feel good about is part of why the episode feels murky to me as a whole. So, not a great episode, I have to say. Like, obviously, I think the performance is solid enough, but it does get a bit repetitive in the middle, where it feels like there's a lot of scenes of him talking about his childhood memories and the characters around him getting kind of concerned and frustrated that he's fixating on this. There's too many scenes of that. Like, there really is a lot in the middle of this episode. This is absolutely one of the episodes this season that could have been cut down to the half hour and would have probably benefited from it. So there you go. That's the incredible world of Horace Ford. There was actually no next time on at the end of the episode. Rod didn't, he did a little bit of narration for the end of the story like he normally does, but it never went to Rod afterwards where he told us about next week. For whatever reason, maybe there was a break here in the season, so they didn't have the next one ready or whatever. But I can look at IMDb and tell us anyway. So next time we've got an episode called On Thursday We Leave for Home. And the description is as follows. The first human space colony is about to be rescued from the forsaken planet that they've been on for decades, for 3 decades specifically. But their leaders having a hard time accepting that that change will happen when they get back to Earth. Okay. I mean, I'm inherently more interested in this one, for sure. Like, this is a full-on science fiction premise. I'm on board. I'm home for the best. But yeah, that was my thoughts on this Twilight Zone. Let me know what you thought of this one in the comments, and of course you can support the show by hitting that like button. It does help a lot. It helps more people find the channel and find the reviews. But if you want to go above and beyond, you can go over to patreon.com/MailFuzzTV and support everything over there for some money every month. get some bonuses while you're at it. But that is the show. So thank you very much once again for watching or listening. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV in the Twilight Zone.